Our third honoree, Desmond Tutu, is Archbishop Emeritus of Cape Town and former head of the Anglican Church of South Africa. He is the world-renowned Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who earlier as chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, brought a peaceful settlement to the end of apartheid, and today is a tireless champion of freedom, human rights, and peace. Here's a video of remarks by Archbishop Tutu on the experience of South Africa, taken from programs by NTSC and the Charlie Rose program.
I suppose that human beings looking at it would say that arms are the most dangerous things that a dictator, a tyrant needs to fear. But in fact, no. It is when people decide they want to be free. Once they have made up their minds to that, there's nothing that will stop them. There is no hope for any relationship which has broken down unless someone of the contending parties says sorry and the other is willing to forgive. There is no future if there has been a breakdown and there is no forgiveness. It wasn't the prosecution that was having to try to prove something. It was the perpetrator telling us from their own mouth, the horse's mouth, this is in fact what we did. So we got the truth from them. We got the truth in some of the most heart-rending instances where people had been abducted and buried secretly. And no one had known what happened. And we were able to go and exhume. On one occasion, they went and they opened a grave. And a young man, whose brother it was, says, yes, that is my brother. I bought him those shoes. We acknowledge some horrible things have happened to you. We give you the opportunity to tell your story, a story that for so long has remained untold, to give you a voice so that you are no longer a voiceless, anonymous nonentity. We hope that this telling will assist in the rehabilitation of your dignity. And many of those who came forward attested to the fact that just the telling had somehow helped them. Very, very humbling, listening to people who had been grievously, they were hurt, treated in an abominable fashion, and you expecting them to spew forth anger and resentment and a lust for vengeance. Nothing of the sort. They come along and they amaze you with their magnanimity. If you torture, that is a gross violation of human rights, whether you are liberation movement or apartheid government. Torture is torture. But it was the taking responsibility, the being accountable, because you can't say it is aberrations when a cabinet minister says his predecessor as state president gave him orders to blow up a building in a very busy part of Johannesburg, knowing that there was a very great risk of people being killed, so that it is in fact attempted murder, attempted killing, which is in the act, it is defined as a gross violation of human rights to attempt any of these things. The world actually recognizes goodness when it sees it. And this is what gives me this thrill about this new millennium. That, yes, awful things have happened, but also some very good things have happened. And the last word that can be spoken about us is not about our capacity for evil. It is about our capacity for good, for generosity, for gentleness, for love.
I'm very pleased to present our next speaker. Born in Ghana, George Ayittey is Distinguished Economist in Residence in the Department of Economics at American University in Washington and President of the Free Africa Foundation. His many books include Africa Unchained, Africa in Chaos, The Blueprint for Ghana's Economic Recovery, Africa Betrayed, and Indigenous African Institutions. Professor Ayittey.
Well, first of all, let me thank the Independent Institute for organizing this event. And I think you all agree that this event is real worth it and that the Independent Institute needs to be supported for this. And I have a confession to make, and that is, I was going to begin this speech with a little joke, but after listening to Andy Garcia and his emotional presentation, I thought liberty is not an issue that you joke around with. If you have suffered oppression, you really understand what it is to be free. So I canceled the joke that I was going to tell. It wasn't funny anyways. But I am very, very and profoundly honored to be paying a tribute to a great man, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, whom I have profoundly admired and I've always taken to be my hero. And as many of you know, in the pantheon of great African liberation heroes, Archbishop Desmond Tutu stands tall and unique. And many of you know and associate his work with the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. But there's far more to this great man than just the struggle against apartheid, and I'll get to that in a minute. Now, born in 1931 in Klerksdorp, Transvaal, he was ordained as a priest in 1960. Then he went to Britain to study theology and returned to South Africa, and there he became the Secretary General of the South African Council of Churches in the early 1970s. Now, he burst into the political scene after the Soweto riots in 1976. And the riots were provoked by an attempt by the racist National Party's government to use the Afrikaans as the main compulsory medium of education in black schools. Archbishop Desmond Tutu rallied world public opinion against oppression in South Africa. And it is important to notice that during this particular time, the ANC was in exile, and Nelson Mandela was in prison. So Archbishop Desmond Tutu, in effect, was the Lone Ranger. the lone black African voice with moral authority against the struggle against apartheid. I mean, he vigorously challenged the constructive engagement policies of the Reagan administration and advocated for disinvestment against South Africa. A lot of people criticized him and saying that, well, look, sanctions against South Africa will hurt the black people. And they said, well, at least even if it hurts the black people, they will be suffering with a purpose. Now, for comparing apartheid to Nazism and communism, his passport was twice revoked and he himself thrown into prison briefly in 1980. But the world paid attention to his struggles and rewarded him with a Nobel Peace Prize in 1984. 2 years later, he became he assumed the presidency of the All Africa Conference of Churches. And this provided him with a platform to launch the campaign against apartheid from African capitals, which culminated in the formation of the frontline states against apartheid in South Africa. Then he was also able to organize more than 3,000 people in protests in Cape Town, which within months brought about the release of Nelson Mandela. And as you all know, elections were subsequently held. The ANC won those elections. Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa, and he appointed Archbishop Desmond Tutu to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Now, dear Archbishop Desmond Tutu, for your courageous fight against oppression and injustice, we salute you. We are very much proud of you, and I'm one of those who have followed you, and there are also many of us who are sincerely following in your footsteps to advance your cause, and would like to assure you that we'll carry your cross much farther. Mr. Chairman, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, as I said in the beginning, there's far more to Archbishop Desmond Tutu than this very incomplete biographical sketch indicates. His great contribution to African liberation transcends South Africa. He was the only one of the great African heroes. He was the only one who recognized that oppression is oppression regardless of the skin color, the ideology, the sex or religion of the oppressor. He was the only one. To you, it might sound obvious that this is how it should be, but that wasn't the case in post-colonial Africa. Because much of the world, and I could relate to Garcia's point, in much of the world defined freedom in racialist terms. In the world, especially in the Western world, it was often assumed that, well, because Africans, put an end to colonial rule, okay, Africans must be free. I mean, you and I know that is patently false. Fact of the matter is, true freedom never came to Africa, much of Africa. You see, what we did in Africa was that we traded one set of masters for another set. We traded white colonialists for black neo-colonialists. And the oppression and the exploitation of the African people went on unabated. That wasn't true freedom. As a matter of fact, independence was in name only. Now, in the West, you couldn't say this because political correctness stood in the way. You couldn't condemn the atrocities of black African leaders because if you did so, if you were a white person, you were called a racist. And African Americans also shied away from criticizing black African leaders because they wanted to express racial solidarity with them. So nobody would touch black oppression in Africa. And in Africa, we couldn't also criticize the oppression of black African leaders against their own people. Why? Because their leaders were afflicted with what I call intellectual astigmatism. They could see with eagle-eyed clarity the oppression perpetrated against black people by the whites, but they were hopelessly blind to the atrocities and the injustices meted out against black people by their own black African leaders. Now, this double standard was what is called the ruination of postcolonial Africa. It's an abominable double standard. When Idi Amin was butchering Ugandans at the rate of 100 per day, nobody lifted a finger to condemn it. The world kept quiet. Had that many African giraffes been slaughtered, you could have imagined the uproar in the whole world. Now, this double standard is still preventing black African leaders to criticize the abomination that we have in Zimbabwe today. Why aren't they criticizing Mugabe? 2 reasons. The first, they want to express there's an African solidarity which says that it is a taboo for one African leader to criticize another. Okay. Then there is a second reason. The second reason is that these leaders themselves are doing exactly the same thing against their own black people in their own black African countries. So who are they to criticize Mugabe? Out of the 54 African countries, only 16 of them are democratic. So who are they to promote democracy in Africa? Now, this is the hypocrisy, and it is a painful truth. Hypocrisy which has been raging across Africa. These were the leaders who were marching down to South Africa to demand one man, one vote, which the blacks there should have. But they themselves had instituted in their own countries de facto apartheid regimes in their own countries against South Africa, against their own black people. Archbishop Desmond Tutu saw this hypocrisy and railed against it. May God bless him. Apartheid, by definition, or in essence, means that it is a system of governance. It means exclusion or separation. It's a system of government where a group has monopolized both economic and political power and uses that to advance their interests to the total exclusion of everybody else. Now, well, let me tell you something. I got news for you. This was exactly the same type of governance we had in the rest of Africa. In South Africa, it was the whites who monopolized political and economic power to advance their interests and excluded blacks. We all knew that. In Sudan and Mauritania, it was the Arabs who monopolized both economic and political power and used that to advance their interests and exclude the blacks. In Rwanda and Burundi, it was the Hutus and Tutsis who monopolized political power, and they practiced tribal apartheid. Elsewhere in Africa, it was one political party which monopolized political and economic power and used that to advance their interests under the one-party state systems. Then we had the group being military, which monopolized economic and political power, used that to advance their interests. The military generals, for example. And notice this, the military has been the scourge of Africa. All these countries that have imploded in recent years in Africa were all ruled by military generals. Rwanda, military general, Juvenal Habyarimana. Somalia, imploded in 1991. General Siad Barre. Burundi, General Pierre Buyoya. Zaire, General Mobutu Sese Seko. Liberia, General Samuel Doe. Sierra Leone, General Joseph Momoy. Togo, General Eyadema. You can go down the list. Of these countries which have been ruled by military generals, let's not talk about Nigeria, which is just, military generals have reduced the once promising giant of Africa to a midget. Now, Archbishop Desmond Tutu was one of the very, very few, he's an exception, who recognized that the political systems that were established in post-colonial Africa were far more tyrannical than the hated colonial systems that we had. But of course, he couldn't say this. But for his courage in saying this, shed a light for many of us. And it was for this reason that I dedicated my first book, Africa Betrayed, to him. And I quoted him extensively in my book. And I'd like to read you a few of these quotes, because the few of these quotes provide insights to the sort of the political systems, the oppression and the tyranny we have suffered in post-colonial Africa. Now, first of all, let me read you this. At the Nairobi Africa Conference of Churches in December 1987, Archbishop Desmond Tutu said that it is sad that South Africa is noted for its vicious violations of human rights, but it is also very sad to know that in many black African countries today, there is less freedom than there was during that much maligned colonial period. This is what he said in 1987. Now, he repeated the same statement a year later at the All Saints Cathedral in March of 1990. He lamented the fact that there was even more freedom during the much maligned colonial period than in many African countries today. He said this: It is true that God's children in Africa suffer because there have been less freedom in their countries than during the month of colonial periods. And African leaders need to be reminded that there is totalitarianism and despotism nearly everywhere in Africa. And he reminded them that when your people are free, then you can also walk freely, and you will not need huge security to protect you. That's what Archbishop Desmond Tutu said in 1990. Now, he's also railed against the suppression of freedom of expression. And he said this, please listen carefully. And in a speech to Oxford University in 1990, he said this: I should confess to our shame that on the whole, when we in modern Africa have not been able to accommodate differences of opinion, when you differ from somebody, if you don't agree foursquare with every point of view, then this is taken to mean that you are the enemy. But that is not how it is in traditional Africa. In traditional Africa, a chief was a good chief because he was able to work out a consensus. And that consensus were arrived because people had different points of opinion, and I have to confess that there is fundamental weakness that we have at this present time. In other ways, and you see, this is still true. Still, out of the 54 African countries, only 8 of them have an independent and free media. Now, this is the type of struggle that we need to continue in Africa. In Africa, we need to promote further not just political freedom, but also intellectual freedom and economic freedom. And I'd like to assure the great African hero, my great African hero, that he should rest assured that we will continue with the struggle to make Africa totally free. Thank you very much.